Hi everyone, welcome back to Steve's Garage. If you've been following along for a bit, you know that I lifted my V70 XC using some custom coilovers and a set of spacers that Adam Nonis had originally come up with. The lift has been great, but one issue I ran into was positive camber. Not only did it look a little funny, but it also created some pretty bad camber wear on the tires. It may not be totally apparent in these clips, but as the tires began to wear more, the outside edges were on the wear bars while the insides were totally fine. I'm sure most Volvo people are familiar with BNE dynamics. They actually make an adjustable strut mount that I thought would be perfect for not only correcting the camber, but also be a better solution for the spring seat. I didn't actually have any issues with the modified OEM spring seats I was using, but we all know they tend to be a weak point, so I figured replacing them with something that's actually meant to accept a coil spring wasn't a bad idea. So while this video is mainly about me trying to fine-tune the lift on my car, it can also serve as a visual guide to installing the adjustable strut mounts on your car, albeit with my own little addition of the lift spacer, but I think you can work around that. Speaking of which, the one thing I did want to replace was the original plastic lift spacer. The spacer is flat, but the strut tower has some curvature to it, and because of this, the spacer flexes over time, and I did get a hairline crack in one of the thinner walled areas. The BNE units are manufactured to match the curvature of the tower, so I wanted to place the spacer between the upper strut bearing piece and then the spring seat piece, that way there could be a flat mating surface. Because the original spacer is meant to sit on top of the strut assembly, it wouldn't work between the two BNE components, but being that I had that strut mount, the original spacer, and now a 3D printer that I could use to prototype, I felt pretty confident in my ability to come up with a solution. Because the upper mount piece is slotted to adjust the camber and caster, I needed to incorporate that into the spacer so it could align correctly when everything is bolted up. This proved a little tricky since those slots weren't centered in the circular area themselves, so it took a little extra measuring and positioning to get it right, but overall it was a pretty simple thing to model and print. After 2 revisions, the spacers were at a place that I felt confident printing a full thickness version to truly test fit it. Once I was confident that prototype part would work, I sent the files to Shapeways to be milled out. Maybe I'm just excited to see something milled out of metal, but I think the final product turned out pretty cool looking. On the prototype pieces, I had a small SG logo to denote the top of the part since the slots are not symmetrical. I didn't do that on my spacers because they added a bit of cost, and I figured it was easy enough to figure out and mark the top side. Because there's now a spacer, I also needed longer hardware than what came with the BNE kit. I picked up some longer bolts from Bellmetric, and this is when I discovered a mistake I made when test fitting everything. The slots were just slightly too small. The bolt would go in, but it took a bit of force, and the spacers didn't really want to move that easily. I was trying to maximize wall thickness on the spacer itself, and I guess my tolerances were a little off moving from 3D printed plastic to a big piece of metal. I didn't show it in the video, but I was able to use a burr bit to bore the slots out a little bit, and they went from basically being an interference fit where I couldn't properly adjust the spacer, to being the correct tolerance where the spacer could slide, but there wasn't a bunch of slop between the spacer and the bolts. The last thing I needed to address was the length of the bolts, but I knew this would be an issue. As you can see, if the bolt is too long, it will contact the spring seat, but in an effort to maximize the number of threads that would be engaged, I didn't want to go with a shorter bolt and risk it pulling out now that it's holding a spacer between the bearing and the spring seat. It was an easy adjustment using my bench grinder, just grind down each bolt a little bit, and it was ready to test fit again. It's a little tough to see, but the bolt is fully tightened down and not contacting the top of the spring seat. At this point, everything was test fit as much as I could without actually working on the car, so it was time to disassemble the front end. I did feel a little crazy digging back into this just to chase camber issues, but I wanted my tires to last a little longer, and alignment shops would always yell at me about the camber being out of spec when all I wanted was a toe alignment, so let's go. Before disassembly, I took a camber measurement from the brake rotor with the car on the ground. It's a good idea to take a measurement here and then with the car in the air, that way you know the relative difference and you can dial things in with the adjustable mounts. I'm not going into detail about pulling the struts out because I covered that in my first lift video, and it's really no different than pulling the struts out on any P80 Volvo. Be sure to check out that video, and if you do have any questions, feel free to leave any questions or comments here. I can help you out. Once it was all out, I could inspect it on the workbench, and I have to say, it looked incredible. I did mention that crack in the spacer earlier, but it wasn't a failure point, just a hairline crack and maybe something to keep in mind. The spring seats looked great, there were no signs of cracking or separation. And all this to say is that besides the camber issue, the lift was solid. I'm just pulling this apart because I'm trying to fine-tune things. At the end of the day, everything performed great, even if it was modified or used outside of its intended application. Now that it's all apart, we can actually get rid of the strut bearing, bump stop washer, top nut, and spring seat. The BNE mounts replace all these components. If you're into things this far, assembly isn't really going to be that difficult. Slide on your coil spring, bushings, and spring seat, then tighten that top nut down. The spacer will go on top of this, but it doesn't get bolted down yet as the bolts have to go through that top strut mount piece. Moving over to the car, the mount bolts to the strut tower and the strut will bolt to that. That being said, I found it best to leave a little slack in there to get everything positioned. It probably had to do with the lift spacer in my specific application, but that was my experience, so I'm just sharing it. The carriage bolts slot into the mount, so there's no need to try and counterhold them. You can just tighten them down from up top. Now you can grab your strut, and the spacer if you're going that route, and bolt it up to the mount. This was made more difficult with the spacer because it was harder to line everything up, but in a typical installation it would have been simple to line the bolts up and tighten it all down. Once the strut is snugged up to the mount, you want to tighten the mount down to the tower and get the rest of the strut and front suspension components attached and tightened down properly. Again, I'm glossing over this because it's kinda universal and covered in other videos. If you haven't already, spin the coil seat up to where it should be, and then we can get to work on trying to dial in the camber. If you've never used one of these before, the basic idea is that you zero the gauge out with a known plumb surface like a wall. Then you get a value with the car on the ground, and when you lift the car and take the wheel off, you adjust the gauge back to that value. Now when you adjust your strut, you know how many degrees you're moving and should have a good idea of where it will land when the car is back on the ground. Now I know the magnet gauge on a brake rotor isn't the most accurate, but this isn't a race car. It's a 20-year-old lifted Volvo, so close enough is more than fine. I didn't try to get it perfect on the first round. I made a small adjustment that was better than what it was, put the wheels on, drove it around the block to let things settle out a little bit, and then took another measurement with the car on the ground. It took me a few tries to dial it in, especially because too much movement in the negative direction and you'll start pulling the axles apart. I suggest doing small adjustments and keeping an eye on things like your CV axles and other components to make sure you're not putting too much stress on any one part. Remember, you're pulling a lot of components to their limit as far as geometry goes, so proceed with caution. Overall, I have zero complaints with these mounts. They look awesome, and I ran them for over a year and a half without any problems from the mount or my homebrew spacer setup. A little bonus is that by adjusting my camber to a more acceptable angle, I also gained a little bit of clearance between the spring and the body of the car. Lastly, the Lux steer you see mentioned in the details on the BNE site is the real deal. The steering was butter smooth with zero feeling of resistance like I had with the stock components in either the stock height or the lifted height. I definitely recommend these to anyone with a P80 that has altered suspension, lifted or lowered. I don't think you'll be disappointed. I know this was a little different than my typical tutorial video and I don't actually own this car anymore, but if you have any questions about installing the BNE strut mounts, please leave a comment. I'll definitely try and help you out. Circling back to my quick mention about axles being an issue, my next video I'll be installing subframe spacers meant for P2 cars in an effort to further correct the suspension geometry and stop blowing axles. So keep an eye out for that one if you're rocking a lifted P80, as I think it's really good to know. Thank you so much for watching this video, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss that next one.